Okay, hello everybody. Welcome back. We are continuing with World War II. We are going to talk about Lecture 5 today. Lecture 5 will encompass, hopefully, the liberation of Paris and much of the Allies' victory in Europe, and end with the surrender of Germany. So in late August 1944, the Allies enter Paris. You can see these are the gates to the city of Paris. It almost looks like this guy's talking on a cell phone, but really he's just playing with his mustache. In late August 1944, the Allies entered Paris. By September, they had successfully liberated or freed all of France from German control. This photograph in the slide shows American troops in a tank passing the Arc de Triomphe after the liberation of Paris. So this is a big milestone and a iconic World War II photo. Oops, sorry, didn't mean to do that. Let's go to the next slide. The Allies next turned their attention to invading Germany. And you can see Allied troops, U.S. troops, going through the snow in Belgium. You can see an American soldier guarding German troops that are captured during what's called the Battle of the Bulge, also a very famous World War II movie. British and American troops pushed in from the west, and the Russian army advances from the east. In December 1944, the Germans launch a last-ditch counterattack and try and split the Allied forces. The German offensive, which took place in the Ardennes forest in southeastern Belgium, created a bulge in the Allied lines. The battle thus became quickly known as the Battle of the Bulge. Over 1 million soldiers fought in this battle, making it the largest land battle of the war. The fighting lasted for over a month, and in the end, the Germans are forced to retreat. So the caption on the picture on the right-hand side of the slide, you don't see it here, but the caption would read, "We were getting our second wind now and started flattening out that bulge. We took 50,000 prisoners in December alone." So the United States takes 50,000 German soldiers prisoner during the Battle of the Bulge. That's a lot of prisoners. The next slide is us firebombing Dresden. And as the Allies pushed to end the war in Europe, the U.S. and British planes began to drop bombs on communication centers in eastern Germany in order to aid the Soviet advance on Berlin. Dozens of cities are destroyed as a result, including the German city of Dresden, and this is an event that remains controversial to this day. Dresden was a cultural center, a center of art and music and fine arts. It had no significant military or industrial areas. It was famous for the fine china that had been produced there for hundreds of years. Over the course of 3 days in February of 1945, the British Royal Air Force and the U.S. Air Force dropped load after load of bombs on Dresden, starting a firestorm that quickly engulfs the entire city. When the flames finally died down, there was virtually nothing left. Statistics show that of 28,410 houses in the city, 24,866 were destroyed. Estimates of the number killed range from 25,000 people to 135,000 people. A 9-year-old survivor of the bombing described the hellishness of his experience. 9 years old. "We saw terrible things. Cremated adults shrunk to the size of small children, pieces of arms and legs, dead people, whole families burnt to death. Burning people ran to and fro, burnt coaches filled with civilian refugees, dead rescuers, and soldiers. Many were calling and looking for their children and families, and fire everywhere. Everywhere fire. And all the time, the hot wind of the firestorm threw people back into the burning houses they were trying to escape from." So people still argue over the necessity of the bombing. Some have claimed it was militarily unnecessary because at that time, Soviet forces were less than 20 miles away from the city, while U.S. troops were 40 miles to the west. Others have even gone so far as to characterize the bombing of Dresden as a war crime. Those who defend the bombing have asserted that it was hardly unprecedented or unprovoked, since German planes and rockets had killed thousands of civilians in England alone. They also note that Dresden acted as a rail base for facilitating the transport of German soldiers to the Eastern Front on trains. So, was it cruel and unusual punishment? Was the firebombing of Dresden necessary? Was it punishment? Was it unnecessary? These are questions that historians ask, and if you dig in the right archives, you can find the answers. So, in our next slide, you see that Germany surrenders. This happens March 1945. It had become clear that Germany would soon be in the Allied hands. Facing certain defeat, Hitler takes his own life. He commits suicide in a bunker with his mistress, Eva Braun. And with Hitler dead and the city of Berlin surrounded, the Nazis surrender on May 7th, 1945, to General Dwight D. Eisenhower. Eisenhower, a very famous Californian, becomes president after the war in the 1950s. And you also have a big hospital in Palm Springs that's named after him. Dwight and his wife Mamie lived in Palm Springs after they had retired. He was a famous golfer, not famous for golfing, he was famous for being a general. He had coordinated D-Day, remember. So the next slide is going to talk about Victory in Europe Day. And on May 8th, 1945, the Allied powers celebrate VE Day, Victory in Europe Day. Tom Fletcher, who's a civilian living in England at the time, described VE Day as such. On the 7th of May, 1945, Germany surrendered, and the 8th of May was declared VE Day, Victory in Europe. The whole world seemed to go crazy with dancing, singing, and parties in the street and celebration drinks. As a group of maturing teenagers, we planned a pub crawl that evening, and we were off to the center of Bristol. Although the dancing, bonfires, singing, and kissing and hugging of complete strangers carried on, unfortunately, the pubs or the bars ran out of beer. By about 9:30 p.m., every pub was dry, and it had been drained of anything drinkable, but the fun continued dancing around the bonfires. So you can see a little bit of the mess. This is from the city of Toronto, and you can see the headlines. You can see the people celebrating, throwing confetti in the air. It looks like a lot of people were happy that victory in Europe had been attained. So the next slide is going to talk about the war in the Pacific, which is going to rage from 1944 to 1945. You can see in the picture, these are the soldiers, the U.S. soldiers, raising the American flag after capturing the island of Iwo Jima, which is in the South Pacific. So let's talk a little bit about the war in the Pacific. So the Allies looked to quickly end the fighting in the Pacific now that the war was over in Europe. By the fall of 1944, Allied forces had Japan in retreat. Led by General Douglas MacArthur, the Allies took back control of the Philippines in the spring of 1945. As the war continued to go against them, the Japanese took to extreme measures to try and slow the Allied advance. One such measure involved the use of kamikaze, K-A-M-I-K-A-Z-E, kamikaze aircraft, or flying suicide missions in which planes loaded with explosives were flown directly into U.S. ships. It is estimated that as many as 5,000 kamikaze fighters killed themselves by dive bombing into Allied aircraft, carriers, and battleships. And more than 5,000 Allied naval personnel died because of kamikazes. So ultimately, the kamikaze missions could not stop the Allies from moving closer and closer to Japan. In the spring of 1945, U.S. Marines gained control of the islands of Iwo Jima and Okinawa. IWO space JIMA is Iwo Jima. Okinawa is OKINAWA. So in the pivotal battle over Iwo Jima, more than 100,000 U.S. troops fought to take this island from a heavily entrenched and fortified Japanese force of 25,000. Though the Americans suffered almost 25,000 casualties, nearly all of the Japanese soldiers died. Okinawa, which lay less than 400 miles from Japan, involved even more combatants. Nearly 100,000 Japanese defended the island against some 180,000 U.S. troops. After 3 months of fighting, the U.S. finally takes Okinawa at the cost of almost 50,000 casualties, and the Japanese suffer staggering losses, with only 7,000 or so soldiers remaining alive to surrender to the Americans. So 93,000 Japanese soldiers are killed. The Allies can now use Okinawa as a staging ground for the land invasion of Japan. A land invasion, if the land invasion will come. What you'll see in the next slide is the birth of the atomic bomb. Here are the technicians working on it. And the battle for Iwo Jima and Okinawa demonstrates Japan's fight to the death attitude and the unwillingness to surrender no matter what the costs. The Allies know that using ground troops to get Japan to surrender would be difficult and would result in a huge number of deaths and casualties. Some estimate that nearly 1 million Allied soldiers would die in the operation. Yet there was an alternative. Prior to the beginning of the war, President Roosevelt had approved a program called the Manhattan Project that had the goal of building an atomic bomb. Top scientists from around the world, including refugees from Germany, worked to complete the bomb before the Germans could. On June 16, 1945, the first successful test of the atomic bomb took place in the New Mexico desert. Truman chose to use the weapon against the Japanese in order to bring a quick end to the war and avoid the 1 million casualties that the U.S. might suffer in a ground assault. On August 6, 1945, the U.S. bomber Enola Gay, Enolagay, the bomber Enola Gay dropped an atomic bomb on the city of Hiroshima. On August 9th, a second bomb was dropped on the city of Nagasaki. So, here's a picture of Hiroshima, which shows the city after the bomb was dropped. The atomic bomb destroyed almost 90% of the city. When the bomb exploded, the temperature at ground zero rose to 7,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The explosion killed 70,000 people instantly. An additional 70,000 were dead by January, and they died from burns and radiation and other injuries. Nearly all of the victims were civilians. So you can see the entire city is leveled, 140,000 people die, and nearly all of them are civilians, not military people. This is the United States sending a message to Japan: surrender or continue to suffer. Like I said, after August 9th, the bomb that drops on Nagasaki has similar effects. These atomic bombs finally forced Japan to surrender. On September 2nd, 1945, Japan formally surrenders aboard the U.S. battleship Missouri. Within 2 weeks of the Japanese surrender, the U.S. troops under the command of General MacArthur had occupied the country, and World War II is officially over. So, hope you got some good notes there, a lot of good information. I hope you're reviewing your notes and getting ready for a surprise quiz. Thank you for listening to Lecture 5. Have a great day.